Greetings, class from Hanoi, Vietnam. Hope you're all doing well. Vietnam has been great, wonderful people, and amazing food. Oh, I love the food. So it's all going well. And in fact, in the class that I'm teaching, we were talking quite a bit about NGOs in Vietnam earlier this week. The World Wildlife Fund is active. Probably sounds like the most active nonprofit in the country, and it's pretty cool. There's a mammal about the size of a deer called the swallow, and they hadn't seen it for 15 years, and it was spotted by a camera trap 2 years ago. Which is amazing to me that a mammal the size of a deer can elude all human observation for 15 years, and they were just uncertain about whether had gone extinct because there weren't many left at that point anyway, or what had happened, and then voila, the camera trap found it, and they went out looking for it and found it and bred it. And anyhow, it's been a good example to learn about and then use in class. But today we are talking about grant writing and getting this launched. So what I want to go over today is basically who gives out money for via grant writing. So we're not talking about charitable donations where, well, you know what charitable donations are. So we're talking about having to write proposals to get the money. So on the front of, or on the screen here, there's this cartoon which I clearly stole from cartoonstock.com, and agreed, we fund only those proposals we can understand. And if you take away nothing else from the next 5 weeks, take away that, you may have the best idea for conservation on the planet, but you need to be able to convey that idea in writing to somebody reviewing the grant, keeping in mind that that person reviewing the grant, yours is one of probably dozens that they're reading through. So the trick with being successful in grant writing isn't just coming up with a good idea that's grant worthy, but conveying that idea in your grant and making it very clear to the outsider what you're proposing. And that's a lot of what we'll talk about over the next 5 weeks, is how do you make a grant very readable and make your ideas really stick, so that when the grant reader puts it down, they can say exactly, or pretty close, or they can say generally what you're proposing to do. But that's for later. For now, we're going to get into who gives away the money and the types of grants that are out there. So roughly 6 types of grants. First is the program grant, and that is program grant is what you propose to do something that has a prescribed goal that is related to the mission of the organization. So it's a subset of activities that happens within the organization. That's different than an operating grant, where you're essentially asking for money just to run the organization and asking the funder to extend a fair amount of trust to you that that money will be put to good use. With a program grant, you have to be very detailed in your description about what you'll do with that money. With an operating grant, it kind of comes across more as, hey, give us money to run the organization and know that we're doing a good job with it. The third is a startup grant, and these are increasingly hard to, one, even find funders that support startup grants, but two, to actually be successful in getting them. As the name implies, these are for organizations that are just getting off of the ground and may not even have their 501c3 status yet. So there are, again, not many opportunities there are not many funding opportunities out there for startup grants, but there are a few out there. Capital grants is big stuff, big expensive stuff like vehicles and buildings, big price tags that only come once. Meaning once you build the building, the costs go way down, and you just have to maintain it. Once you buy the vehicle for an organization, so they can go do monitoring of the landscape, there really is very little cost after that. So a capital grant is stuff. It's not people, it's not salary, it's not programs, It's big ticket items. The fifth one is an endowment grant. These are endowment, and I think we've talked about this at some point in class. It sounds, I have a vague memory of us talking about this, but an endowment is a pot of money that earns investment income because so that money is put into some combination of maybe stocks and bonds and mutual funds and savings and money market accounts, things that earn some amount of income. And what the organization is able to do is spend that investment income. So a rule of thumb in endowment world is that on average you can expect 3 to 4% return. Now with the last few years, that's been higher on endowments because the economy has been doing really well. And so things like stocks and bonds have been, or stocks especially, have been returning higher yields. But you're going to have your down years as well. So it averages out to be 3 to 4, 3 to 5%. So what that means is if you have a $100,000 endowment, you're going to get $3 to 5 thousand per year in money that you can spend. Well, $3 to 5 thousand per year is nice, but it doesn't make a big dent in most organizations. If you think of an employee who maybe is making $45,000 a year, well, $3 to 5 thousand off of a $100,000 endowment isn't much. So endowments are helpful when they're in the millions. Quite honestly, they're not so helpful when they're only in the hundreds of thousands. It's hard to get your head around that thought that something that's hundreds of thousands of dollars really isn't that helpful. But if it's only producing 3 to 5% a year, there's a limited amount that you can do with that. And then the last one is research grants, so things that we're typical to writing around here at the university. And as their name implies, it's to do rigorous scientific research. So some questions to ask before you launch into grant writing, and one of the things you'll hear come across from me throughout the next month is, there's organizations, and I've definitely seen this myself, that write a grant because the grant's there and the money is there to be taken by somebody. Really, in my opinion, you should know you should have a very clear idea of what your goals and objectives are as an organization, and then you'll know if a grant opportunity is the right time for you or not. So there's kind of well, I think it gets on the next slide. So some questions. Do you have the right organizational status? A number of funders will require and limit their grants to 501c3 organizations. Is the proposal or is the grant within your mission and goals? So we've talked about mission creep. We've talked about the importance of having a mission statement that truly guides the work of the organization. And this is where it helps make decisions on, is this the type of grant we should go for or not? What are the funders' priorities and what have they supported recently? And we'll take a look at that in a second. And then, is this the right time for your organization? So let me go to the internet and take a look at a few examples. So this is the Pharaohs Fund of the Bohemian Foundation, and that is a foundation based here in Fort Collins. We are extraordinarily fortunate to have that foundation because it's got a lot of assets, which means money. And they generally focus all of their grants on northern Colorado. So the fact that our relatively modestly sized community has a foundation the size of Bohemian behind it is fantastic. If you've been to New West Fest, they fund all of the music at New West Fest. But just as an example, I'm on their frequently asked questions page. There's a question of my 501c3 status is pending, can I still apply? And what you'll see in their response is if it's still pending, if your 501c3 status is pending, but you expect to receive notification from the IRS within 30 days of the application deadline, which nobody would ever know if they're going to be getting their notification within 30 days of the deadline, because that would imply that the IRS communicates with you. And my experience has been they don't. But you can see that you need 501c3 status to apply for the Bohemian Foundation grants. National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, or NIFWIF, if you will. Again, all funders will have some type of page of who is eligible to apply for their grants. So you can see here who can apply, and for them it's federal, state, and local government, educational institutions, and nonprofit organizations. So theirs isn't limited to 501c3. They are available to government agencies. The goal of National Fish and Wildlife Foundation is really habitat restoration, and given that a lot of habitat restoration occurs via government agencies, that's why they make their grants eligible to government agencies. And then I had mentioned in the slide to look at what they've funded previously. So we're going to go back to we're going to look at yet another one. So I thought I pulled that up. New Belgium Brewing Company, just as an example of taking a look at what organizations have funded in the past. So if we scroll down to the bottom of this page for New Belgium, and it says 2014 grant summary, read the PDF, which we will. And here's who they gave their money to and how it was distributed last year. And this is really helpful because as you try to decide, is your proposal and your organization going to be competitive and going to be aligned with generally what the funder is about, this gives you a barometer on what they were talking about last year. So I want you to picture a group of people sitting around a table that have read your grants, and now they're going to make decisions about who gets the money. And this sheds all kinds of light on what that discussion was last year. So the types of organizations, this is within their youth environmental education grant area, and they have more than one. We're just going to look at youth environmental education. And you can see the types of organizations that have been funded. You can Google those, get a sense for what they're about, the locations they're in. With New Belgium, they only support organizations that is in their distribution area. So you have to be able to buy a Fat Tire beer in order to get a grant from New Belgium. Not all funders will have this information. Government almost always will because they're required to have that as public record, but private foundations won't necessarily have that. Here's another one. So back to Bohemian Foundation and the Pharos Fund. Here is a list of organizations that they funded in fall 2014. Again, the organization name there on the left, the name of the project that was funded, and their award. Now here they have some general support. That's just that operating support, and that's often hard to come by. So Bohemian is still providing that kind of support, which is relatively unique. So it can be, as I said, really helpful to see what these organizations have funded recently to get an idea if what you're proposing is similar to where their priorities are right now. So is it the right opportunity for your organization right now, or are you just chasing money because the grant is there? And I'm telling you, for me, when I get an email from someone that says, hey, take a look at the grant opportunity below, let's partner and do something, that something needs to have been on our radar at the Environmental Learning Center as a priority for us in order for us to go for it. I just feel like that makes more sense, that goal came first, and then we realized that the grant was a good opportunity. So don't pursue a grant simply because it's free money. Pursue a grant because your organization has decided that the type of thing that grant funds is a priority for the organization. And then some other questions to ask as you're deliberating writing a grant is, what is the capacity of your organization right now, and what is the capacity of your community? So who does similar work as to what you might propose for a grant in your community? So at the ELC, I don't write grants to support our garden. We have a small garden at the ELC. Because there's the gardens at Spring Creek in Fort Collins, and quite honestly, they do a better job at community gardening and teaching people about horticulture and gardening than we can at the ELC. So I wouldn't really write a grant for tens of thousands of dollars to invest some kind of programming into our garden because we already have an organization in Fort Collins that does that. And why create that competition in a community that's relatively small when it comes down to it? Do you have the partnerships in place to deliver the grants? A lot of times what you're proposing to do in a grant, you can't do alone. You need to have other organizations as part of the team. And those partnerships are ideally in place at the time you're pulling the grant together. It can be very hard and it can be a little murky if you're building a partnership and writing a grant at the same time because you haven't really worked out what each other's work styles are and the organizational personalities are these things compatible? And sometimes via the process of writing a grant, you realize they're not. And then you're like, do we pull the plug on this grant because we're getting some red flags, or do we push through because we've started it and it's too hard to pull back? And then the last bullet there is, do you actually have the capacity to implement the project? Now, a lot of that capacity you will ask for in the grant. You'll ask for staff time, for example. You'll ask for salary to support people's time to work on the program. But inevitably, if it's a big grant and you might be hiring another person if you get the grant, is there literally office space for that person at your organization? Does the person who would supervise them have the capacity to do some additional supervision and so on? So there's some other questions to ask beyond what are the merits of the idea. Okay, here's how grants were, the types of grants, here is how the distribution was in 2010 to 2012 as far as the types of grants that grant money supported. Whoops. So you'll see that the three biggest chunks over here on the right-hand side of the circle are education, and then this middle chunk is health, this middle blue chunk, and then human services. So that accounts for more than 60% of all grant money are those three areas. And environment is a little piece of the pie at 7%, and science and technology is even a smaller piece of the pie at 3%. So it's just to kind of put this all in perspective that the amount of money being given to environmental and scientific causes is relatively low. Now, sometimes we can frame what we're doing in these bigger chunks of the pie. So education, you work for a nature center or a zoo or a museum of science. You can certainly frame and couch what you're doing as educational. So that kind of opens up that piece of the pie for you. And increasingly, there's greater and greater recognition that a healthy environment is connected to public health. And that's been known, of course, for a while, but as far as it really being acknowledged and supported through grant funding, I would say that's more recent. So you can also couch your environmental work as a public health outcome as well, and then again, that makes you eligible for a pretty big chunk of the pie as well. And then going from that list I showed you earlier on the types of grants, about half, 46%, are going toward programs, about another quarter is going towards capital projects, and not a very big piece of the pie is going toward that general operating. So it gives you an idea that program grants are really where it's at as far as where most of the money is being distributed. Okay, some jargon that you need to know. Reactive grants. With reactive grants, these are coming from typically the government or very, very large foundations. And with a reactive grant, what it is that funder has already identified what they want and what they need and are asking entities and organizations to submit a proposal to meet that need. So that announcement, that process is usually through what's called an RFP, which is a request for proposal. So let's take a look at one. Actually, let's take a look at, I think I have more than one up there. A few of these. So the first one is through USAID. USAID is the United States Agency for International Development. It is how the U.S. government distributes foreign aid. is through that federal agency, USAID. And Mordecai will talk to you in more detail on the next class session about USAID. He's got a fair amount of experience with managing and dealing with USAID funded projects and paperwork and bureaucracy as well. But in this example, USAID and their office in Peru has identified climate change adaptation as a high priority for that country, and therefore a high priority for the foreign aid dollars coming from the U.S. government. And what it does is it outlines this funding opportunity in great detail. So here's the objective. So this is the RFP that we're looking at. One important effect of global climate change is the reduction in naturally stored water resources, which for Peru means melting glaciers and a decrease in the size of highland wetlands. I'm going to kind of speed down to the second part of this paragraph. General project outcomes will be long-term, sustainable approaches that help reduce the impact of climate change on glaciated and highland wetland ecosystems and on those that depend on these ecosystem services. So you get right off the top a pretty clear idea. Here's what USAID is looking for as far as outcomes. Your job in the proposal is to describe how would you go about achieving those outcomes. And just to kind of give you an idea, we scroll through and scroll, and you've got a lot of detail here from USAID on what they're looking for. So that's a reactive grant. Let me give you one other example. Let me close that. Is the EPA, and they have environmental education grants, and you can, down here in the middle, here's a description of the overall program. So United States Congress provides a certain amount of money every year to the EPA to distribute as and through environmental education grants. So the EPA is not really in the business of delivering environmental education themselves, but they get money from the federal government and pass that on to grassroots organizations that do environmental education. So here's their RFP process. You can see that they have EE model grants and EE local grants. You can see where my cursor is here. Model grants are bigger in terms of the amount of money you can ask for, and then local grants are smaller, and as the name would imply, more locally focused. So you can we can click on that PDF, and again you'll get an announcement, an RFP that looks and sounds pretty bureaucratic, but has the purpose explicitly stated here, the number and value of the award. So they're going to give out about $2.7 million nationwide. And you start scrolling through, and it'll outline exactly the type of thing that they're looking for. So let me scroll down. Sorry, I thought I knew it. Here we go. Here's what their educational priorities are these 6 things. So what you propose to do in your grant needs to fit into one of these 6 categories. So again, with an RFP, they've done a lot of the work as far as saying, here's the types of things we're going to fund. We have decided that these are high priorities, so let's go find organizations that can do these things. That's the thinking there. And again, very typical of government grants and really large foundation grants, like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. They do most of their grant funding through an RFP process because they're so big that they can actually send a team of people into an area. I'm thinking of sub-Saharan Africa because they do a lot of work there, and their staff will do an assessment of what's needed, and then they'll create an RFP and put that out for organizations to then do the work. But they're doing that needs assessment piece. Okay, so that is different than the other type, which is proactive grants, which you probably figured since one was called reactive. And this is where the organization outlines what the need is. and it's kind of a blank slate. So um, let me actually take a look. We're gonna go back again to New Belgium, and what they whoops what they have. Actually, let me do this. I'm gonna go to the Pharaohs Fund, and what you can see with the Pharaohs Fund is they will have some broadly defined goals. So they have goal A, to encourage and enable our youth to become productive members of society. And then they have some elaboration there. And then they've got some sub goals. All right. So you get some pretty good detail here. And then they have goal B, to be a catalyst for public awareness, and some elaboration. So what you get in a proactive grant is you get from the organization, the funder, here's generally what their priorities are programmatically and conceptually, but it's not down to this level of detail on what deliverables do they expect, what audiences do they expect you to address. You get to propose that based on knowing this general description of what their programmatic priorities are and themes and topics and so on. Okay, so back to the PowerPoint. And then more jargon to know. Pre-proposals. They're exactly what they sound like. You submit a proposal in advance of the full grant. And usually what's happening there is for funders that receive a lot of grants, they'll do a pre-proposal so they can weed out the ones that they feel don't meet their current priorities or that look like they're probably not going to be a very strong full proposal. So they'll do a pre-proposal, and it's their way of kind of minimizing how many full grants they get later. A letter of intent is different. That's why it's a different bullet here. And really all it is a heads up to the funder that you plan to submit a grant. And it's not reviewed, it's just a letter of intent. It's literally telling the organization, the funder, that you intend to submit a grant in 3 months before their deadline. All that does for the funder is give them an idea of how many grants might they expect, and they can start getting their resources and capacity in order to deal with the volume of grants they're going to get. It's not binding. If you send a letter of intent and then choose that you're not going to submit the grant, that's really not a big deal, and it doesn't sort of put you in a bad position in the future with that funder. So those are the two pre-proposals and letters of intent. And then matching funds are, what are you expected as an organization to bring to the table if you are given a grant. So if you receive a grant of $20,000 and it has a matching fund requirement of 10%, that means you would have to show that you also have $2,000 to bring to that project. 2,000 is 10% of 20,000 if you didn't follow what I was doing there. The grant guidelines will be very explicit if matching funds are required or not. And then the last bullet is indirect rates. And these are the things that are hard to quantify and connect back to a specific program that the organization is running. It is things like toner in the printer, and turning on the lights and paying the utility bill, and the bookkeeper that does all of the payroll for the organization. These are all things that can't be, the cost of them can't be attached to a specific project. And so they get lumped into this thing called indirect, which is also sometimes called overhead. Okay, this is just an example of a pre-proposal, one that I wrote to a funder called the Christensen Fund. It was not successful, unfortunately. And you can see it's pretty basic. These are the geographic priorities of the Christensen Fund, so it asks you to let you know which one you're looking at. Here's a bunch of basic, who are you, what's your organization, and then a little more contact info here. And then this last part is enough detail, and it actually goes on for another page, but how much are you asking for, what's the title, and what's a basic description of it. And so it just gives them an opportunity to then look at like, wow, we're going to have a lot of proposals with the African Rift Valley as a high priority area. And so they'll review all of those pre-proposals and then tell people like me, thanks but no thanks, you're not going to make the cut this time around. So on one hand, it saves me the time from having to develop a full grant. On the other, it's a bummer to not be able to apply for the full grant at all. Okay, so here's what I want you to do is I've listed three funding agencies at the bottom here, and I want you to come up with a program idea for one of the nonprofits from your little fake communities that we've been creating throughout the semester. Come up with a program idea. Just do that in 5 minutes. Don't spend all your time on just coming up with the idea. And then take a look at one, two, or three of these funding sources. Take a look at their what they describe as their priorities. Take a look at what they have funded recently, if that's available, and it isn't always available, and get an idea of what you're proposing for your NGO is fundable by these organizations based on that track record and based on what they say their priorities are. So stop the presentation and do that activity, and then we'll resume. So hit pause, and okay, I'm going to assume you hit pause, and now we're back. I'm still here. Okay, moving on. So I'm going to divide the funding sources into public and private. So public, we really just mean government, and here's the advantages of government grants. Is one, they're typically larger. By larger, what I mean is higher dollar amounts, higher dollar limits on what you can ask for. There's often less requirement for matching funds, and sometimes that requirement is none, so no need to bring any money to the table. Indirect and salary costs are typically allowable, and that indirect is usually a percentage. And most medium and large nonprofits know what their indirect rate is. That's usually not a mystery. So, and it's somewhere typically around 15 to 25%, somewhere in there. They all sort of calculate it themselves. And then salary as well, which is great because to do grants and to implement them, you need people. The guidelines are typically explicit, and that includes very clear directions on how the grant should be submitted and what the various subsections should be, and how it's going to be reviewed. And I think I closed it. The one. Did I? Oh, I did. Shoot. The one from USAID Peru had very clear. Oh gosh, that's going to be a mess to go try to find that. It has very clear criteria on here's how your grants are going to be reviewed. So the evaluation criteria is what we're talking about there. And that is extraordinarily helpful to have. It really takes a lot of the mystery out. And part of grant writing sometimes can sort of feel like it's this mysterious process of what are they looking for exactly, and what are they going to evaluate us on. Well, with government grants, they make that explicitly clear, and part of that is because they have to, because it's the government, so it's all public record. Oh gosh, here we go. And voila, okay, we're back in business. So if you look at, oops, it was right up here. Review application submission and review information. That's talking about the criteria for how it will be reviewed. Here we go. Review information and evaluation criteria, page 9. And so if we scroll down to page 9, so you've written your grant, and when they review grants, here we go. Here's the evaluation criteria for the applications. And it outlines this all for you. The technical merit, the ability to describe succinctly what the project envisioned based on the requirements of this APS. APS is government jargon. The letter of inclusion of sustainability and so on, past performance. So it gives it very clear, well, somewhat clear. This could be fleshed out in more detail to help the grant writer out. But the point is that they at least give you something, and with private foundations, you often don't even get that something. With the EPA, they're super clear. They say, here's the criteria, and here's how many points will be attached to each of those criteria. So there's no guesswork with those EPA grants. Okay, the disadvantages are, whoops, that is not where I thought we were, is government grants are often more bureaucratic, more rules, more paperwork, and Morty can tell you all about it. And in fact, for some government grants, and mostly federal government grants, we the ELC, really kind of deliberate, okay, do we have a good enough shot at probably getting this grant, given how much paperwork that it's going to take, not only to write the grant, but to do all of the reporting that's required of the feds. Is it going to be worth it to us? Like the bureaucracy can really get that bad with reporting. There's often more applications, and therefore it's more competitive. So keep that in mind. It often has more applications because the dollar amount allowed is higher. The process often favors applicants with a track record, and that's really because once you've sort of cracked the nut on successfully getting a government grant and managing all that paperwork and getting a sense for what they're looking for, then you can replicate that down the road. And the availability of funds is vulnerable to politics. Wonderful politics. So here's a section of the EPA Environmental Education Grant Guidelines. And you can see there's some language in here. EPA expects approximately 2.8 million. So expects because at the time they advertise for their grants, they don't actually know if Congress is going to give them the money. So they have to use this sort of apologetic language and tone in their RFP. So not at all unusual. Okay, and then you have private foundations. And really the advantages of private foundations are all of what the disadvantages were of government grants. They're typically less cumbersome as far as the proposal process. There's usually fewer applications, and a lot of that is because foundation grants are typically focused more locally or regionally, and when it comes down to it, there's a limited number of eligible organizations in a community to even apply for them. So there's typically less competition, and less bureaucracy and less red tape. The reporting for a Bohemian Foundation, for example, that reporting takes probably 30 minutes to do when you're done with a grant. For an EPA grant, an environmental education EPA grant, easily hours, and usually longer than that because you get so tired of working on it that you put it aside and come back to it days later. And then the disadvantages are all the advantages of the public sector, the government grants, which is funding is typically smaller. So the Bohemian Foundation, again, as an example, limits their grants to $30,000, which is still decent given the size of our community. But with EPA grants, you can submit for hundreds of thousands of dollars. With National Science Foundation, which is another federal government agency, also hundreds of thousands and even millions. I had a $990,000 grant from them once. I can't think of a non-federal agency that would have that I could apply for that amount of money from. With foundations, the priorities can change more quickly. Part of that is because they're not government, and they'll have a board of directors, and that board can have a meeting and decide to change their priority areas, and it's just a little more nimble. And that's an advantage, really, because they can change their priorities based on the needs of the community that they serve. So for the Bohemian Foundation, when we had the fires of 2012, followed by the floods of 2013, they had a temporary grant area that was all about restoration and sort of community healing and building back up social capital. So they were able to do that real quickly. There's often more mystique in review and evaluation of grants. I've written probably 12 Bohemian Foundation grants in my day. I have no idea how they're reviewed. I've been successful on about 8 or 9 of them over the years, but I still don't know exactly how they're being reviewed. There's usually no or very low indirect allowance in those grants, and sometimes limits on how much you can ask for in salary, and matching funds are often required. Okay, so here's what I want you to do next is somewhere between one and all four of these, answer the following questions. What is the limit of what is the limit of amount of money that they'll give? I'm sort of being wordy there, number one. What's the limit of how much money they'll give? How many pages are the grant guidelines? So that is the description by the funder of their grant process. So you can count that by web pages or by PDF pages. What I'm really going for there is to see how different government grants are from private foundation grants. Does the funder require matching funds? And do the guidelines provide any information about how the grant will be evaluated? So the goal here is, one, to get you digging into grant guidelines and to get an idea of the different sort of tone to these two different funding sources. So you've got Trout Unlimited Embrace a Stream grant, Bohemian Foundation's Eros Fund grant, the EPA Environmental Education grant, and then NSF ACEL. ACEL is Advancing Informal Science Learning. Informal science is things like zoos and museums and anything that's teaching science outside of a formal classroom environment. So take a look, depending on how much time you have left, I'll let Megan or Morty give you some direction there. Look at between 1 and 4 of these, but try to do at least 2 and at least 1 from the private foundation and 1 from the government list. Okay, I think that is, in fact, all I've got. Hope you're all doing well, and I will see you real soon. All right, bye.